days. So it's a chance, I think, for you guys to quiz me specifically on reversal, but while we've got a chance live, anything else that comes to mind. So here's just a little thing quickly, and you may have seen these images before. This is a product of ours called Images of Organizations, which exists primarily, or did exist primarily, in the physical domain. And these are kind of themes, regular themes about working in teams that seem to be fairly universal. We've used them around the world, but I like to use them in relation to some specific questions. So here, this reversal activity, considers things like remote management and leadership, but more team working in general. So is there an image number that speaks to you about the kind of, maybe management or leadership issue you've been asked to consider recently? And I'm just trying to get a sense of what's live for you. Stick it in the chat, or by all means just, yell out and tell me if any of these cartoons spring to mind about any kind of challenges right now.
So I think for me, it's been our managers are having a hard time delegating.
Okay.
And they're also having a hard time with managing people remotely. Just finding a good level of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been over communication and under communication. We haven't found the Goldilocks just right yet.
Yeah, no, I recognize that. I don't know of anyone who's got it 100% right, and even when you think you've got it, something else changes. Okay, that's great. Is there an image that speaks to you about that? I'm a very literal person, so I probably don't see one, but just in case you do.
Are you sharing your screen?
Oh, I thought I was. I should be. It says stop share.
I'm only seeing our videos.
Okay, let me try again. Okay, any sharing happening yet?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, good. Joe, anything for you that springs to mind?
I was just kind of studying all of the images there. So I work with senior executives at Target, and I mean, there's several different images that I think make a lot of sense for some of the struggles they face. Image number 3, for instance, I think can be common, where you kind of lose sight of the enterprise and putting that at the forefront of your decision making, and instead we find senior executives operating in silos and doing what they think is best for their function or the team that they're leading. So anyway, yeah, I like these images. I get it.
Sure. Okay, no problem. And yeah, interestingly, when you work with senior executives, I know some people say, well, when I try to explain these and they say, well, we use cartoon images, and they would say, well, I don't think I could use cartoon images with senior executives, but certainly I've got a lot more confident, and I've used them at all levels, because I think people are, particularly senior people, they recognize, and it's a way of getting them stepping out of their jargon and perhaps, opening up a little bit quicker. So these days, when you've got very little time, I think imagery works very well. And if people don't use it, I always encourage them to try to do so. Okay, that's great. So there's a couple of things in there, and what that's useful for me is just to start to think in relation to reversal. And are either of you familiar with reversal, just out of interest?
I'm not.
No. Okay.
We use currently colorblind as in some of our programming with rave reviews. So when I saw this email come through, I thought, oh, I would love to learn a little bit more. I'd love to see another product from RSVP, and yeah, that's kind of where my head's at.
Okay, great, excellent. And I know Cindy, colorblind's used in your organization as well, but I'm not sure what other activities. So this will give you a sense of it, because in some ways you might think it's similar, but in lots of ways it's quite different. And certainly the structure at face value looks a little bit different. Okay, so let's dive straight in. So you know, if you clicked on that link and that will be there, I'll send you both the recording as well. You can get a bit more detail of Reversal. The first one is our UK and international site. The second one, the .com, is our US site. So exactly the same, except obviously in dollars with local shipping. And that little picture there is an idea of physically what you get in terms of materials if you purchase Reversal. So there's a grid there. In European terms, it's A2 size. So what's that? A couple of feet. So it's just big enough to put in an overhead bin if you're traveling by air. I do remember those days a couple of years ago when we went about in aeroplanes. And you get a facilitator guide, as you do with all of our tools. Those coloured materials in the bottom left are some magnetic shapes, and actually that's a plastic 3D cube. So again, maybe some kind of uninspiring materials at this point, but hopefully that'll start to make sense when I explain what the activity is about. So we call Reversal a toolbox, and Colourblind, I think you both mentioned we would call a toolbox as well. And what we mean by that is contained within that is everything that you would need to prepare, deliver and review a learning experience, typically designed originally with a very specific learning focus. Colourblind around training air traffic controllers. Reversal was around how do you manage people when you're not actually viewing what they're doing. So remote management, but also looking at things like managing marketing teams, R&D teams, you know, where you don't actually know what necessarily the answer is or what area they're working in. So again, it will be relevant. So it will be predictable in terms of how that activity unfolds based on our testing and frankly, some human behavior. Focus on some key areas of learning. Simple to facilitate. So again, we don't like to design tools that take a long time to learn how to set up. We want you as facilitators spending the maximum time observing behaviors and moving towards the learning rather than worrying about the technicalities of how the activity works. It should be versatile, several uses and applications, and that often comes from clients might say something like, I want an activity that looks at remote management. It's really hard to isolate a very narrow behavior and put that in the context of an engaging activity. So there are always things that go on in any activity. So we have people who use Reversal simply for team building. We have some people who use it for assessment centres. So at that point, it's really up to you, I guess, the versatility. But we can tell you as a will where it came from. And this is a practical tool, so it's for face-to-face and in-person learning. Although we are planning to create an online version of this that will run on our platform. We can talk about that if that's of interest to you. So the exercise challenges teams to do things like delegate and support effectively. So if you kind of scroll through these and then when we start to look at the activity, you can maybe try to think back against some of these. So it is a remote problem and they've got timescales which are up against them. Each individual has a responsibility, which is always good, I think, in a team exercise, and they have to bring that back to be used by the team. But at that point, no one in the team can check it, controvert it. So there's a lot of areas around team trust in this as well. They do have to balance the amount of time they spend planning and theorizing against task achievement. And for some groups, that's important. There will be errors and how they correct them is important, both from a behavioral point of view and a technical point of view. And they have to use and think about individual expertise and capability. And that won't be probably the typical work-based roles that they have, but that's always useful, I think. It does require precision and a demonstration of attention to detail. So going back to that picture, you get a brief. You get happens to be number 81. There are 81 pieces of magnetic resources. As a facilitator, that's useful because if you count them back in, you know you've got all of these little small pieces. But we do provide some extras because they do often go missing. And there's an assembly grid. So what I'd like you to do is imagine that we're going to play this as a couple of participants. So I'm going to try to give you an experience of a physical activity remotely from several thousand miles away. So just take a few seconds to read that brief, particularly those first couple of paragraphs probably. So just let me know if you've had a chance to read it.
I'm good.
Yes, me too.
Great. Okay. So what's your immediate reaction having read that? Do any ideas on what you might be doing, or does any of it make any sense to you?
It definitely makes sense to me. I found myself already strategizing as I was reading through the constraints. I was like, well, what would be the best way to go about doing this?
Okay, great. And the reason I do this, I think it's always, I've found it for facilitators, it's always best to kind of get yourself into participant mode first, because sometimes if you just read about these things, it's hard to remember or realize what people will feel like. So that's a fairly normal reaction, Joe. The other reaction that you get is, if you happen to be an engineer like me, the idea of two-dimensional diagrammatic versions and 3D models probably doesn't faze you too much. If you're not, people can already start to think, I've got no idea what this is going to do. Doesn't sound like it's my type of thing. I think I'm going to struggle. Okay, so those are perfectly natural and in fact designed to be this way. And we'll talk a bit more about that briefing anyway. But the time has started at this stage. So you're handing a single, sheet, letter sheet, A4 sheet to the group. They can choose, whether they appoint a leader to do it. Do they hand it out? Does someone read it out? All of these things might have some bearing later on how they approach it. So here is what the grid would actually look like. So this is just a photograph of the grid and some of the magnetic pieces there. These photos aren't ideal. I just took some snaps earlier today, so the blues and the greens might not show too well, but you've got yellow, blue, red and green shapes, and they're either T-shapes, rectangles or squares. So there's a mix of those. So if you imagine a team of 10, they're going to have 8 or 9 pieces each. So that's all they get at this point, and they've got that brief. So going back to this, I want you to imagine again that I'm going to ask you to take a look at this 3D model. So at this point, it's a 3D model because it says so. You haven't seen it. You've got some colored shapes. You've got a grid. As Joe said, you maybe started theorizing. And I'm going to give you an experience of this just in a second. So what we would normally do as a facilitator is say, okay, you guys have got the brief, the models outside. If you've got the luxury of 2 rooms, it might be sitting behind a door. It might be under a cover, in another part of the room so they can see it. As long as they can't view the model, it doesn't really matter when. You tell me when you're ready, and I'm going to walk out with you. I'm going to look at my stopwatch. I'll give you a minute to look at this model. You're not allowed to take anything with you. And when you come back in, then you can basically do what you want. Okay. So I'm going to time this for a minute. So imagine that these are the shapes that you've been given. So you have a couple of yellow squares, a red square, a couple of green squares, those red triangles, blue one, and a couple of T-shapes. So these are kind of, if you imagine, 2-dimensional magnetic pieces. So you've got 10 pieces. You have to leave them there. I'm now going to show you the model, and I'll just let my watch run for a minute. So have a think about what your strategy would be, knowing that you haven't really seen this model before, probably. So imagine you've approached it. We advise people not to move it. So you could walk around it, but what you're seeing essentially, I know this is a 2D picture, but the top of a 3D model, and you're seeing the kind of front side. So if you walked around it, you would see the 2 sides and the back. So just kind of concentrate probably at that front and top bit. So you've had about 30 seconds. Okay, so that was exactly a minute. It might have been a very long minute or a very short minute, depending on where your head's at right now. So what would you do? here's your grid, and there's your pieces at the bottom. Any thoughts about, would you do anything with the pieces? Would you try and place them anywhere? What would you say to colleagues? Because usually, if you're the first one that's gone out, I can guarantee you when you get back to that room, people are going to say, and so what did you see? What's going on? So just top of your head, what would you say?
I'm a little speechless. I'm not sure exactly. I think I had already forgotten that I was only able to work with the pieces that you see at the bottom right there.
Yeah.
So what I was doing, I forgot that part. And so what I found myself doing over the course of the minute was noticing the placement of different pieces and trying to, you know, just start pretty foundational.
Sure.
You know, start somewhere.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thanks, Joe. Perfect. Cindy, any thoughts?
I was looking for the pieces that I thought I had on the square, and I was also trying to wrap my brain around how that grid makes the square.
Yeah. Okay. So, great. Now let me come back to that. Okay. So we're throwing in here quite deliberate confusion at the start of the activity, and for some people, and I'm going to jump out from kind of facilitator view and design to kind of participant view. So, you know, I'm doing this quite deliberately. We wouldn't obviously be doing this with activities. So what we're designing here is, you know, a remote challenge, you know, so people have got a brief of what we've to achieve, but so far only one person has got a better sense than anyone else. So the first thing is, who went out first? Is it the person who always goes first and sticks their hand up? Is it the person you gave the leadership role to? Is it someone we said, look, this seems to be about spatial awareness. Who's really good at that? Were any of those kind of questions asked? Or was it just, you know, you're closest to the door, Cindy, you go first? So areas about, you know, if you're approaching a new problem and so on, you know, when we come back to the review, you might start out there. But you both pick basically the two strategies that there are. One is to look at the model and try and get a sense of it and maybe blocks of color and describe it to people. So Joe might have come back and said, right, give me some pens and I'll try and sketch out. I think there was, you know, a lot of yellow here, a lot of blue here, or maybe specifically I just looked at this cube. And you'll get people like Cindy who said I went out with that, but actually I'm not sure I get this idea of that grid compared to the 3D model, because it tends to be, as I say, people who've, you know, if you're an architect or an engineer used to looking at plans, then it might make sense to you. But I've yet to come across a group in lots of years of working with this where you don't find one or two people who would be able to explain that concept of how what we're looking at on the screen is a kind of opened out plan of a 3D cube. Do you both see that? Does that make sense to you yet? Because I'm going to go through some other stuff anyway if it doesn't.
Yes, it does now.
It does. Perfect. Good. Okay. Yeah. So that's the substance of the activity, and usually those first couple of visits by people kind of dictate in some ways how the activity is going to go. So if you imagine I said there was about 81 people, you've got 8 pieces. So imagine there's 10 people in the group. If you're number 10, you're still working in the dark while 9 people go out and tell you what it is that you're trying to do. So you've not only got management of people going out remotely, but you've got a remote person coming back and trying to manage other people. So that remote management is immediately a two-way street. And I think it's one of the reasons this activity has become a bit more popular during lockdown, because that, you know, we used to be talking about that when, you know, you're managing a field sales team, or as I say, you've got an R&D team and you're managing them, but now almost all of us are in this kind of situation. So that's the way the activity progresses, and each person must go out one at a time. So if you get 10 people, we usually say 12 visits is on average roundabout enough to be able to complete this, but it's a tough task. And you can't go out a second time till everyone's been out once. Okay, so that's the way we progress it. Let me go back just a second. Yeah. So the pieces I chose, and I'll show you them here. So this could be one of the places that your pieces went out. So to be able to do that from a standing start would be pretty amazing. So if that was the pieces I gave you, you would probably come back and not know exactly where some of them were. I also cheated a little bit because there are only 2 red pieces and both happen to sit together on the side of one of the faces, which you can't actually see in this 3D model because it would be on the left here. So how you get from a kind of blank grid to a finished model is going to take more than a few visits, and you probably have to work out, as I say, that error correction. So if someone does try to put something in the right place, someone goes out, can then check on whether it is correct. So it's again one of these activities, and if you're familiar with colorblind, you'll recognize that often groups start off saying, you know, this is really tough, we've got no idea what we're doing, put a bit of process in place, and then, you know, the last bit of the exercise are kind of motoring. This will have a similar feel to it. Okay, having given you the introduction I've just given you, it looks really difficult from the start. So from that model, here's the pieces that go, and I just wanted to show, we've got this in the facilitator guide. So again, to help people understand this idea of a cube that's folded out. And in fact, the grid works just in the same way. So below you can see the 3D model and how that is explained as you go out. Does that all make sense so far?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So what we would do, as I say, is work through that. As I say, you're looking for one person to go out. So as you can see here, our suggested time is about 35 minutes right at the bottom there for the whole activity. Again, as a facilitator, like most things, once you learn the activity, you can flex that depending on what you want. But again, most groups tend not to do this. But if you've got 12 people to have a visit, that's kind of 12 minutes activity time and 23 minutes planning time. So if you've got the types of teams who want to overanalyze things, then they'll spend 30 minutes discussing it and then have wasted 7 minutes of opportunity to go out and actually view what that looks like. So it needs people who can actually break down that task into what needs to be done in the limited of time we've got available and how much time we can spend planning. So there are some rewards on actually going out early, making some best guess judgments and come back in. Again, ironically, probably more relevant in COVID times than it ever was before. The way we make decisions and implement things has certainly changed over the last 18 months. And as I say, so when you get to the end, and often I'm asked how successful will teams be, and it's a hard question to answer. Usually as facilitators, we're invited in to work with teams that are not already, Formula One pit teams, working at the absolute peak. Usually they have some challenges. The more challenges the team have with relationships and implementation, the more difficult they're going to find us. So a well-performing team who knows each other well, got good relationships, will be able to do this. A dysfunctional team will be dysfunctional at this exercise. In terms of moving to review, so again, we'll go back to the kind of areas that we described earlier. So it's about, did they manage to delegate and support effectively? So that bit of a question I asked, I don't think I've ever seen a team immediately say who thinks they're really good at spatial awareness. But I have heard good leaders say, hands up if people, think that they'll have a chance of being able to do this. Who wants to do this first? No pressure. So how they actually use those people as scouts often in the early days is important. Did they use resources efficiently? So they've got people, they've got pieces, and they've got time, and how they use those three will dictate how successful they are. The problem is definitely remote, because at no time does everyone have a full view of that. Even if you've all been to see it, you can't keep all of that in your head. So it's a tough problem in a tight timescale. So how they collect information individually and how was it used by the team is quite important. So what I've seen with teams sometimes is, you come back in and people immediately, the extroverts say, okay, talk to me, tell me what happened. And if you're an introvert like me and go out, the best thing you could do for me at that point is not to say a word let me download my memory bank, play with my pieces, and then I'll talk to you, rather than the other way around. So starting to look at, even the way we prefer to work can be important in this. Clearly a balance, as I mentioned, against how much time you spend in planning and replanning and altering those plans as you go forward over various visits, against taking that time. You really want to use those 12 minutes to go out and view it, because that's your best chance of seeing what you actually have to do. And if you waste all of those, it's a pretty big thing, I think, to build up or to pick up in a review. So how you manage error connection. So if you're the first person that goes out and tries to place your pieces, you're almost certainly going to make some mistakes, and how you and the team deal with that is important. If you're the last person, if you're visit number 12, and you maybe only have to go and check, then that's clearly a much easier task than going out first. And do the teams recognize that balance as they go through it? And as I say, whether they've got individual expertise, or even check out if they have expertise or capability. And then finally, do they stick with it? This requires a bit of resilience. It's the kind of stuff you might say, well, this feels a bit like, something that's repetitive, that's maybe in financial terms, we have to do it. It's a compliance type task. And again, I've seen it used in that kind of context. So any thoughts? Do you recognize, having kind of seen the task, where some of those areas of learning might be able to be brought out?
Do you have some best practices for how teams do solve it properly and do it in a high functioning way?
Yeah, I think it's probably a collection of all of these things. So the first thing they will do is, very early on, is usually take a bit of time to plan. So where teams have been successful, I've seen, if it's a mixed team in terms of both experience and age, sometimes you'll get young people saying, okay, let me just go out, this is a bit of a game, I'll go out and have a look and I'll come back and tell you. And if there's a kind of experienced leader in that team, they'll maybe say, well, I think we need to spend a few minutes getting an agreed plan of action before we do that. So there's a bit about planning up front that certainly helps. And then, as I say, it's how you go about it, building it up in stages. So recognize the first few people are going to give us an overview of what we're going to do. So Cindy, go take a look. Don't worry about the detail. Just come back and give us all, so we've got a good appreciation. And Joe's going to go next. And Joe, why don't you take that bottom cube on the left? Now, do you understand what we're talking about? The other things that work really well for teams is when someone comes back and says, and owns up and said, I know you told me to look at that bottom left cube, but when I got there, to be honest, it just became a mass of colours, and I don't think I can give you any sensible help. So being honest and having a bit of trust rather than guesswork, these are things that help. So if you take the positive out of that list and people do them, then that's generally how they become successful. Does that help?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Anything from you, Joe? Is that self-explanatory?
It is self-explanatory. One thing that I'm wondering, Graham, and maybe you're getting to this, is in lieu of in-person experiences right now, curious if you have explored a virtual option for this yet, or what that might look like if you did.
Yes, we have. So again, you may not be aware, but kind of March 2020, we started getting calls from people saying, we've got your physical materials and now we can't do any face-to-face training. Can you help us? So we started to look at developing our own platform, and we now have an online platform up and running with things like Colorblind, where to some extent it's a little bit easier. If you're looking at a shape, it's much easier to send a shape and provide someone with it. In this exercise, what you need essentially is a 3D model if you want people to be able to view it remotely. So we're working on having that as a plan. But we've also got some very ingenious users out there. And so one of the things you could do as a facilitator is, I could work with the model that I have here. So what I could do is take each person into a breakout room. I could give them the brief. I could describe to them. I could probably make up on Miro or on Google a kind of grid, and I could probably make something like this. So we would expect to have a completely virtual version, but if you had a physical version, I think you could probably find ways to make it work with the physical materials.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So then, having got to the end, whether successful or not, you're kind of moving into the review, and it's always hard to say, well, here are review questions you could use, because it depends on what you're applying it to. But here's a couple of questions from the facilitator guide. So again, you want to get people thinking about the process that they used, whether they were successful or not, because there might be good positives that come out of that. So this idea about planning, not just having a plan and sticking with it, but deciding when you need to replan and what do you replan based on, because each time you go, you're likely to get a bit more of information. So this kind of external referencing, anyone that manages groups that have to do external referencing often have to replan and re-implement. And again, with hindsight, because this is about learning. So, learning what didn't work in this, what would you do differently when you come to this type of project? And this type of project might be, managing people that you can't see, or it could be encountering a problem you don't know how to solve, and a group of you are going to try to solve it. And then the second question there is much more around how they did it rather than what they did it. So, if you're looking at behavioral change, if you're looking at styles, if you're looking at building interpersonal skills, what did people actually notice? If you're looking at emotional intelligence, what did they notice about what helped or hindered the team getting to a result? Because this is a team task, not an individual task. And again, we would always say, if you're interested in looking at reversal and not sure about that, by all means get in touch. If you can tell us what kind of learning specifically you want to get out of this activity and want some help in crafting activity review questions, we're always open to do that. Good. So again, I don't want to keep you too long. That's about 40 minutes. Happy to take questions on reversal in its physical form, talk a bit more about what you might do and what we're looking at in terms of the digital version, or indeed, other challenges or other tools while we've got some time today. So do you have any questions on reversal?
I think I was looking at it from an online perspective, and maybe using it like workstations or something like that, where it's everybody's fully remote.
Okay. So. Yep. Well, have you got a particular program in mind, Cindy, in terms of dates you were looking at?
No, it would be for our new managers, and probably not until November-ish.
Okay. Okay. We've got a kind of product plan. Let me come back to you separately. I'll drop you a note, because this is on the product plan to do a fully online version, and I'll let you know when that's likely to be. And if it fits, potentially I could get you involved in some of the beta testing of that.
Oh, that would be great.
Sure. Great. Joe, are you in a similar basis if you're looking at all kind of online stuff just now?
Yeah, primarily virtual. We're not headed back to the office until at least January. And I think really how I've kind of come into this call is just more out of curiosity and belief in colorblind, and kind of curious what else might be out there. I don't know if honestly this is the right activity in my mind for senior executives. I can totally see it being applicable to some of those more frontline or entry level leadership roles where people are really delegating for the first time, and kind of uncovering and discovering their kind of their leadership style and how they show up in situations like that. I don't know though. I'm open to your thoughts on that. If maybe you disagree with me, or I've seen that successful as senior leaders.
Yeah, I don't actually. I think you're spot on. We would typically describe this as a kind of middle management activity, and I think you're right. Unless there was a a particular narrow focus. You know, I think there is enough challenge in it, but I think I would be wanting to understand very clearly where you wanted to take the review with senior managers for this. So yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree. And if you'd come to me with the description you had originally, probably reversal isn't one of the ones I would be talking about. I think if you found colorblind useful with that group, then having a look at symbols online version would probably be something for you to have a look at. And I think there's a recorded webinar I can send you if it's of interest, that where we covered that. Yeah,
I would appreciate that. Send that my way.
Sure. And it was designed to be a kind of more challenging version of colorblind, you know, and by version I mean this idea of working with unfamiliar information. There's essentially 4 times as much information in symbols, and it needs to be sorted. There's another level of kind of hierarchy which suits kind of leadership groups better.
Great, thank you.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, if you don't have anything more, thank you very much for coming along and joining with me. It's one good thing about working this way in the last 18 months is, you know, you don't need to travel from the States, and unfortunately I don't get to visit, but I don't need to spend quite as many hours on the plane. So even to have a chat with a couple of you today is great. So thank you for coming along and joining in.
Thanks, Graham.
Okay, you guys have a good day. Take care.